I don't know how good this recording is going to be. My neighbors have been cutting their grass with a chainsaw, so hopefully you can hear me decently enough. And if not, you can just stop listening and blow your brains out. So, on the current Marxist discussion on the analysis of form and function of the bourgeois state, reflections on the relationship of politics to economics, by here we go. Bernhard Blanke, Ulrich Jürgens, and Hans Kastendiek. How do you like that? Introduction. Introductory note on the publication of this paper. The following study was prepared as a paper for the Congress of the German Association for Political Science, in particular for the seminar, quote, Global Control, end quote. The general theme of the Congress was, quote, Politics and Economics. What are the possibilities for a political system to act autonomously, end quote. Both the theme of the seminar and the general one of the Congress essentially determined the logical structure of our paper. Our central points of inquiry were, quote, not quote, there's no quote, why did I say quote? 1. How on the basis of Marxist theory is the very separation of, quote, politics, end quote, and, quote, economics, end quote, evidently taken for granted by bourgeois social scientists to be understood? On the one hand, how is it to be criticized as a, quote, why do I keep saying quote? It's just italics. On the one hand, how is it to be criticized as a mystification, an external appearance, which presents to the mind, even a scientific mind, as an opposition to each other phenomenon, which inwardly belong together, and on the other, how can it be explained as a reality, made up of separately organized and self-reproducing social relationships? 2. How, in this dual sense, are the possibilities and limitations of action for the state or, quote, political system, end quote, of a capitalist society to be determined? The fact that these questions pose themselves automatically if one works through both the older and more recent bourgeois discussion on the state, Blanke, Jürgens, and Kastendiek, in no way means that our foundation in Marxist theory is mere formality. On the contrary, we believe that a materialist theory of the state must be based on a critique of bourgeois political theory. For it can be shown that recent Marxist attempts at a, quote, derivation of the state, end quote, are stamped by handed-down, quote, theories, end quote, of, quote, the state, end quote, unconsciously borrowed without acknowledgement and mostly without reflection. They infiltrate into attempts at a derivation which apparently only embark from the general concept of capital and hope to get by without any cognizance of the abundant mainstream literature on the state. Even then, and indeed precisely then, quote, prejudices, end quote, creep into the analysis as soon as the concept of the state is issued, prejudices whose consequence can only be discovered in details and are difficult to criticize because the authors think that by simply disowning bourgeois scientific discussion, they have overcome their quite, quote, private, end quote, notions of state and politics determined by their own history of socialization, parental homes, civic education, participation in elections, or political actions. If, on the contrary, one tries to discover the, quote, principal conditions, end quote, of the bourgeois state which appear also in bourgeois theory as central problems, then one finds universally a, quote, bipopular focus, end quote, around which bourgeois thinking about the state has revolved since the classics of political theory. State authority, sovereignty, executive, state apparatus, etc. on the one hand, and right or law on the other, laws, legislation, and parliamentarism, application of the law by the judiciary, etc. Of importance for our work was the observation that reflections on state power and law in bourgeois theory and ideology are shaped to a considerable extent by the problem of the legitimation of political rule, and that the analysis of the functional interrelation between state power, law, and society is distorted precisely by the fact that the separation of politics and economics enters into all these theories as the undiscussed basic assumption. Only with the emergence of the phenomenon commonly referred to as, quote, state interventionism, end quote, does the economy again become a problem, above all as an external problem of, quote, state planning, end quote, for all bourgeois also for bourgeois state theory, which, however, is unable to explain the functional, quote, restrictions, end quote, or, quote, interdependencies, end quote. On the other hand, we have the impression that most Marxist discussion is based on a specific limitation which we shall discuss and criticize extensively in what follows, but the central problem of which we shall indicate here, because it has arisen again and again in the discussion of our paper, informal pre-publication discussions. By, quote, politics, end quote, the complete or perfected bourgeois state is generally always understood, the complete bourgeois state with the resulting forms of intercourse and power struggles on the basis above all of the contradictions peculiar to capital, between the individual capitals on the one hand and between wage labor and capital on the other. The basic form of politics, namely the conflict surrounding and the establishment of legal relations, is simply overlooked in the hasty leap to the fully developed capitalist class society. In this way, the law much too easily acquires in Marxist discussion a purely instrumental character which can produce practical false conclusions, not only of a reformist tendency, but in conceptions which grasp the law as a mere appearance, ideology, mystifying veil. We shall briefly indicate the theoretical mistakes which ought to be refuted by our analysis by looking at a few essential objections that have been raised against our analysis. Objection 1. That our emphasis on form analysis is unnecessary insofar as it is in any case self-evident that under the conditions of capitalist production, relations between people acquire, quote, forms determined by capital, end quote. Therefore, the separation of form analysis and historical analysis is, it is claimed, wrong. Quote, on the contrary, one should proceed from the fact that the development of specific state functions signifies nothing other than the formation of the state, and should thus be the real object of form analysis, end quote. A similar objection is made, agreeing with us in principle, but referring to the quote, not the quote, italicized, organizational forms of the state. Gerstenberger. We were concerned, however, to distinguish that which is understood in normal bourgeois theory also as, quote, state forms, end quote, namely specific organizational structures of the bourgeois state, from the state form. It was first a question of investigating why it is that on the basis of capitalist commodity production, certain social relations are not shaped and regulated by the general forms of capital reproduction developed by Marx, but assume quite specific forms such as law and politics. For this purpose, it was necessary to distinguish between the historically changing organizational forms, e.g. constitutions, bureaucracies, and other types of administration, and those basic requirements of the reproduction of capitalist society which manifest themselves in the necessity of extra economic forms. Only when these have developed is it possible to discover in the empirical variations in the development of the bourgeois state a general tendency common to all capitalist societies and related to the historically and regionally varying traditions, types of constitution, types of policy, etc. It is clear to us that our analysis in this direction is not yet finally accomplished, and that also in the, quote, political systems, end quote, there are still elements to be analytically elaborated which have a general character, the still important work of Agnoli, published in 1967. We regard our work, however, as a framework for such an analysis. This is especially true for those quote, channels and institutions in which generally in bourgeois society demand functions of the capitalist process of reproduction, which require organization by the extra economic coercive force, assert themselves as interests and are brought to a political solution. Objection 2. That we start from, quote, simple commodity circulation, end quote, in which there is as yet no necessity for an extra economic force of coercion, there so it is claimed A, the, quote, identity of labor with property in the result of labor, end quote, is presupposed, and B, the, quote, sphere of material laws and individual action, end quote, coincide, only with the emergence of the tendency of capital to destroy the existence of the wage laborer, and here the struggle for the normal working day is cited, does there arise a struggle for, quote, rights, end quote. Hence right or law, and the force which guarantees it have to be developed, it is maintained, as forms determined by capital. How from, quote, rights, end quote, i.e. conceptions about legitimate needs, we are to derive the form of right or of law remains, however, inexplicable, because the conception that one must fight for, quote, rights, end quote, presupposes this form. A similar objection maintains that law and state can be developed only out of the contradiction between exchange value and use value, between capital reproduction and the needs of the workers, which are opposed to its tendencies. In our view, these objections overlook two central points. 1. Even in, quote, simple commodity circulation, end quote, it is not the commodities or money that act, but people. The argument that these are only the character masks of economic categories overlooks the particular significance of Marx's argument, pointing out that the, quote, actions, end quote, of persons are functional relations of social reproduction, tells us as yet nothing about the form in which people are brought to behave functionally. This occurs certainly not only through law, but also through conventions, forms of consciousness, etc. The essential form is, however, the form of law. This is a necessary form because although the social interrelations in capitalist commodity production assert themselves as reified, quote, objective, end quote, compulsions, their assertion nevertheless requires individual, quote, subjective, end quote, actions. This still says nothing about the idea that there is a free scope of action for deviations, corrections, etc., which is a basic conception of bourgeois thought, especially of a sociology which builds on the concept of, quote, social action, end quote. An examination of the process of exchange, in which it has been said material laws and individual action coincide, shows how the social nexus, precisely because it is established only a posteriori, requires individual action, in which it both transposes itself and is recognized super-individually as a, quote, objective, end quote, nexus. The fact that Marx abstracted from this problem in his analysis of, quote, simple circulation, end quote, in order to destroy the veil of subjectivist notions such as still exist today as, quote, science, end quote, in, for example, bourgeois cost-benefit theory, does not mean that this problem does not exist. To demand of people that they recognize the forms in which the law of value asserts itself requires, over and above the sanctioning instance of money, particular forms which are tailored to fit people as, quote, subjective agents, end quote, and in which there are posited at the same time the mystification of the individual freedom of action, i.e. of will, and the reality of the social nexus of compulsion. This is the form of law and the extra economic force of coercion which guarantees the law. 2. Simple commodities circulation is interpreted in the critique of our analysis as a phase preceding capital production. Against this, it must be emphasized that the forms of simple circulation which Marx develops in Capital are general forms of capitalist production, and the correct opposition is that between general, quote, simple, end quote, circulation and the circulation of capital as phases of the circuit of capital, which, however, is accomplished in the forms of simple circulation, commodity money. The problems which this raises for the analysis of the state are examined more closely in the main body of the article. Objection 3. That our argument that the extra economic force of coercion can relate as extra economic force to the process of capital reproduction only through the medium of the basic forms of law and money overlooks the, quote, reality of state intervention, end quote. 1. Now it is hardly ever said which other forms are thinkable, even if a powerful state apparatus has developed, which the most various with the most various relations to the process of reproduction. It is nevertheless a mistake to confuse the organizational forms of state activity or, quote, methods of intervention, which are not organized in the form of the state, but as a, quote, state enterprise, end quote, or association under private law, or simply as a private enterprise, with their effect, i.e., with the functional relation and the particular form of mediation to the process of capital reproduction. With such organizational forms or, quote, methods of intervention, end quote, the mediated relation to the process of reproduction is overcome only when, quote, state activities, end quote, organize themselves in the material economic forms of the social process of reproduction and are thus exposed immediately to the movement of capital accumulation. But even then it is quite irrelevant whether the state, for example, has taken over part of the share capital of Volkswagen. It cannot solve the crisis of the car industry in that way. The fact, however, that there are, quote, state activities, end quote, whose form of mediation vis-a-vis the process of reproduction is still unclear to us in detail, e.g. the educational sector, or from a legal perspective, the activity of public law corporations, shows that it is important to analyze individually the increase in functions which require state organization and to discover their particular relation to the process of reproduction. This holds true especially for the question of the, quote, general conditions of production, end quote, which we have not examined closely because in our view they are not relevant for a discussion of the form of the state, apart from that of Lepla. 2. The call for a detailed analysis and presentation refers also to the distinction between the, quote, system limit, end quote, and the, quote, activity limit, end quote, of the bourgeois state, which we have made in our article. This distinction has been mistakenly equated by the critics of our article with the, quote, distinction between, end quote, logical and historical analysis. That's my father. On the one hand, we have certainly furthered this misunderstanding by our concentration on form analysis. On the other hand, it should be clear that we base the distinction and the difference between general form analysis and particular analysis of the development of state functions and their specific conditioning by and mediation to the capitalist process of reproduction. Such state functions can be, quote, general, end quote, in the sense that they express an average constellation of capital accumulation and class struggles existing in all capitalist countries. A constellation which is not already posited by the general concept of capital. We have brought these particular structures looked at from the angle of the question of the, quote, autonomy, end quote, and, quote, possibilities of action, end quote, of the bourgeois state, together in the concept of the, quote, limit of activity, end quote. In our view, the chasm, which exists between analysis of the, quote, principal conditions, end quote, and the analysis of the, quote, empirically given circumstances, end quote, can be overcome only through the analysis of particular historically given structures which at the same time as average conditions are general for all capitalist societies at a given stage of development. However, we are all still miles away from a presentation which would have assimilated in its general features the development of capital in the last 200 years. The problem in the continuation of our analysis is therefore to mediate in a theoretically more compelling manner than we have so far managed the system limit and the limit of activity. In these preliminary remarks we have dealt only with the essential objections which have been brought to our notice. Apart from that, we are presenting the original paper for discussion. We have not been able to discuss publications which have appeared since then, October 1973. It seemed more important to make our work accessible to general and public discussion. Problems of recent Marxist discussion on the state. A. The separation of politics and economics, state and society, and capitalism seems to be so obvious and self-evident that one wonders what is supposed to be achieved by painstaking and, quote, subtle, end quote, conceptual attempts to derive the genesis of these different, quote, spheres or, quote, systems, instead of looking directly at the specific mediations or, quote, interdependencies, end quote, and starting on empirical research. We think, however, and that is generally agreed among Marxists, that it is indeed necessary to trace the genesis of this separation, for only in such an explanation can one find a basis not only for an external analysis of the relations, but also for an analysis of the specific internal mediations between these spheres or systems. How can or must such an explanation proceed? In bourgeois state theories of justice or sociological origin, one can find essentially two types of explanation. We leave aside the, quote, normative, end quote. 1. An historical typologizing explanation, e.g. in the work of Weber, Heller, etc. The separation of, quote, state and, quote, society or other social, quote, spheres, which has become self-evident, is retraced historically. The state is then the, quote, modern outcome of a historical process, and as such, as a result of development, it can be typologically generalized. 2. A functional explanation already implicit in the work of the authors mentioned above, but especially in sociological functionalism. One or more functions are reconstructed, and which the state or the political system or, quote, politics, end quote, as such, fulfills for other areas of social systems or in the context of social systems. The state's existence is taken as being explained by this function. Without simplifying, one can identify the, quote, taking of binding decisions, end quote, as the determination of function common to such approaches. This function is assumed to hold for all sorts of human socialization, from the primitive to the industrial society. In content, this function coincides with the concept of sovereignty, which is central to the historical typologizing explanations. If Marxist state theory is not to repeat the mistake of, quote, placing itself on the standpoint of the finished phenomenon, end quote, Capital Volume 2, and taking abstract ahistorical definitions as the starting point for its explanation, it cannot content itself with noting the existence of an institution or sphere of the, quote, state. It must found its necessity in determining requirements of capitalist society. These requirements were developed generally by Marx in Capital, and a, quote, derivation, end quote, of the state must start from there, and all work on the general concept of capital. It is, however, important to keep the theoretical goal in view, namely the conceptual reconstruction of the empirical, historically concrete state in specific bourgeois societies. The derivation of the state form Marx's general categories of capital is confronted by considerable methodological difficulties. It has not yet been made unambiguously clear by Marx's discussion how the, quote, logic, end quote, of capitalist society theoretically reconstructed by Marx is to be, quote, applied, end quote, to the analysis of historical and concrete forms of appearance, or indeed how the relation between logical and historical analysis is precisely to be determined, nor is it clear from what points of, quote, capital in general, end quote, the derivation of the bourgeois state should depart. B. We have said that we are concerned with the theoretical reconstruction of the empirically existing bourgeois state. In order to avoid creating the impression that what follows is pure conceptual scholasticism, we shall briefly outline the questions which the recent Marxist state discussion was initially faced with, even before the attempt was made to answer these questions by direct reference to Marx's Capital. The problem of the state was revived mainly in the discussion of certain historical phases of capitalist society, especially of fascism, and of various obvious problems of the labor movement in the evaluation of measures of the bourgeois state, such as measures of social policy, or more generally of the, quote, welfare state, end quote. Out of these discussions arose essentially two complexes of questions which refer to the supposedly instrumental character of the state. 1. If one understands the state directly as a committee for the protection of the interest of capital, how are those phases in the history of bourgeois society, when it then to be explained, in which the, quote, state apparently acts independently or of or against the interest of capital? This debate, which developed around the key phrase, quote, autonomy of the state, end quote, has by no means ended. From it results the central question: how is the domination of capital over and in the production process mediated into the, quote, sphere of politics, end quote, and the institution of the state? What is the relation of the bourgeoisie as a class to its state? Quote, 2. If the state is understood as an instrument of class domination, how then do we interpret measures which are implemented through or by means of the state in favor of the working class? This debate, too, carried on around the key phrase of the, quote, welfare state, end quote, is by no means concluded. It could hardly be concluded, as nearly all the strategic problems of the labor movement, reformism, revisionism, are involved. The central question which results from this discussion is: how are the actions of the workers, understood as not yet being the, quote, class for itself, end quote, mediated into the, quote, sphere of politics, end quote? Do political victories of the working class, e.g. in elections, change the quality of the state as class state, in whatever way that is understood, so that the bourgeois state can undergo a change in function and become the instrument of social change in favor of the dominated classes? C. We do not want to answer these questions here, but we think it very important that it should not be forgotten, as it sometimes appears to be in some of the recent theoretical essays, that such empirical problems and political questions must determine the Marxist discussion of the state. We also do not wish to draw up a new variant of the Marxist derivation of the state, or to summarize the various answers which have been given to the questions mentioned in order to locate each one within such a theory. Our intention is rather to peg out a framework for a systematic analysis of the bourgeois state. The analysis must avoid two pitfalls. They are: 1. To allow the category determining our point of departure to serve as an implicit answer to all subsequent questions. That is, no concept of the state may be posed at the outset which then needs only to have its various particular features, quote, unfolded, end quote. 2. To restrict ourselves in the derivation of the state to the general concept of capital as portrayed by Marx, and to regard its history and empirical aspect as external to the concept, thereby including them in the analysis as mere modifications. The, quote, general concept of the state, end quote, and the general concept of capital. The, quote, general concept, end quote, of the bourgeois state. In recent Marxist discussions of the state, it has become customary to set out from a, quote, general concept, end quote, of the bourgeois state, even where, for reasons of method, such a postulate is expressly rejected. This general concept seems to be defined by the categories which Marx and Engels use in their Jewish question, the critique of Hegel's law of the state, and in the German ideology, all in the course of their critique of Hegel. Such categories are: the state as standing both, quote, alongside and outside, end quote, bourgeois society, the, quote, doubling of society into society and the state, end quote, the, quote, illusory, quote, general, end quote, interest as the state, end quote. They all fit under the umbrella concept of, quote, bourgeois society summed up in the form of the state, end quote. The reason for the necessary summing up being seen as the conflict peculiar to bourgeois society between, quote, interests which are general or communal and those which are particular, end quote. The state is understood as a form separated from society in which the general interest is preserved or administered. A. Our first criticism is that the category, quote, separate form, end quote, despite its frequent use, is no longer properly understood and thus degenerates into a mere tag. Further, that the proof of the, quote, particularization, end quote, is widely confused with the derivation of the state. One example may serve for many. Quote, in societies based on commodity production and division of labor, we find the most general form category of the bourgeois state in its separation from society, undergone during the during historical development, a separation which is an illusory and contradictory embodiment of social generality, based on a system operating through formal personal independence coinciding with material dependence, end quote. Hirsch, 1973. Even if it is maintained that only the, quote, most general form determination, end quote, of the bourgeois state is in question here, and as yet quite, quote, empty, end quote, determination which has still to be, quote, concretized, end quote, step by step, even so, it must be pointed out in criticism that the determinations of the state taken from Marx's, quote, early writings, end quote, relate to a determined and already substantial concept of the state. In the early writings, Marx and Engels developed the state principally in terms of Hegel's concepts. Although the implications they draw differ from Hegel's, out of the fragmentation of bourgeois society posited by private property. The concept of state with which we are dealing here is, however, still specifically, quote, juridical, end quote, couched in terms of moral and legal philosophy. The counterposition of general and particular, public and private, has been the main substance of classical bourgeois theory of the state immersed in natural law ever since Hobbes and Locke. Whilst this theory understands the bourgeois subject as a, quote, private property owner, end quote, Locke in particular, he is in no way seen in his economic determination on the basis of capitalist production, but rather as the subject of right or law. This concept of private property stands in the total context of the bourgeois classics and characterizes their attempt to found a legitimate rule of domination. The formulations mentioned above, such as, quote, general will, end quote, or, quote, general interest, end quote, presuppose this concept of the subject of right, and they already imply a certain transcendence of the contradictions between particular and general interest by and in the legitimate state. If, therefore, the, quote, particularization, end quote, of the state was first established in juridical terms, it becomes apparent that modern attempts must fail, which posit new economically determined categories in the place of the legal subject, the individual abstract and equal legal person, such as Pashukanis, and otherwise wish to preserve the earlier determinations of the state. They overlook the course taken by Marx's own critique, which progressed from the still general portrayal of private property in the earlier writings to the analysis of the, quote, anatomy of bourgeois society, end quote, and so to the analysis of capital itself. The logical basic category of the early concept of the state, quote, private property, end quote, was thus just as, quote, alienation, end quote, doubling, end quote, transcended in the analysis of the capitalist mode of production. We must remember that it is important not only to decipher this juridical concept of the state as such, but to reverse the procedure, and in a, quote, second step, end quote, to derive its necessity. However, that can only be done on the basis of the general determinations of the capitalist mode of production. B. With the previous attempts to develop the, quote, state, end quote, in terms of Marx's analysis of the anatomy of bourgeois society, setting out as they do from the, quote, general concept of the state, end quote, criticized above, the specific content of this, quote, preconceived, end quote, concept soon becomes a methodological trap. We have said that the transcending of the contradictions resulting from private property is already contained to a certain extent in the concept. In Hegel in particular, the contradictions to be transcended are presented from the beginning in such a manner as to allow an a priori unity to work itself out, quote, in the spirit, end quote. Such a, quote, determination of the essence, end quote, also creeps into the Marxist state discussion, insofar as the state is determined a priori as the, quote, general, end quote, a general competence of the, quote, state, end quote, to, quote, administer, end quote, general interest, end quote, to, quote, regulate, end quote, the contradictions is presupposed. If all the functions of the, quote, state, end quote, are thus already contained in nous, in its essence, inquiries into the reasons for the functions, but above all into the limitations of the state in capitalist society, can no longer be adequately answered. There then remain essentially only two ways out. Firstly, to add another category of, quote, essential being, end quote, that of the class state, and as the, quote, final, end quote, function, or secondly, to point to historical modifications, empirical peculiarities, and political tactical variations. The general concept of capital and the analysis of the state. The shortcomings of definitions of the state so far, or of the, quote, general concept of the state, end quote, are essentially also the expression of an uncertainty of method and theory in the relationship between the general analysis of capital and the derivation of the state. What follows are our reflections on this question, which in our estimation is still an open question. A. We have said above that recent Marxist discussions on the state tries to put the category of form to fruitful use in the analysis of the state. We too see this category as the methodological point of departure for a Marxist analysis of the state, quite independent of the criticism which we had made of the content and use of statements on the, quote, particularization of the form, end quote. We believe that the state can be analyzed systematically only when every preconceived concept of the state has been abandoned, when mere associations and immediately empirically derived notions of the, quote, state, end quote, whether as authoritarian or as parliamentary, democratic, do not already infiltrate the initial stages of the inquiry as premises. The, quote, state, end quote, must to some extent be liberated from a theoretical reconstruction. The substance of this reconstruction, the modern state, can thus, in our opinion, not be analyzed directly, quote, at close quarters, end quote, at least not if it is understood as a compound institution which formally connects the most disparate functions for and in relation to the process of capitalist reproduction. At least not if the modern state is to be understood in its contradictions and in its evidently limited capacity for action. Our inquiry is not directed immediately to the, quote, state, end quote, as a concrete historical structure. We attempt first to show the determinations of the state which can be derived systematically from the general concept of capital. Marx sees this concept as comprising the general laws of motion and the interrelations of a form of society which is both historical and thus transient, as well as being characterized by the quite different necessary relations which make it a capitalist society. These relations, as relations between people, take on determinate forms. Thus commodity, money, capital, wage, labor, but also commodity capital, money capital, profit, interest, wages, as the, quote, price of labor, end quote, are essential forms whose emergence makes a society capitalist. The concept, quote, form, end quote, expresses both the basic problem and the essential characteristic of the historical materialist method, the investigation of the connection between the material process of production and reproduction of the life of socialized people, and the relations between these people who constitute themselves in this process of material reproduction. The materialist method consists then of examining the forms in which the particular relations between men are expressed, and 1. Resolving those forms into their fixed character, a character alienated from man, apparently materially conditioned and ahistorical, and then presenting those forms as having become historical, grown out of and reproduced by human activity, i.e. as socially and historically determined forms. 2. Uncovering the form's interconnections, thus theoretically reconstructing the entire historical social formation. Here the point of reference must always be the present conditions in which the forms have reached the form's furthest point of historical development. The aim of the analysis is not, however, to realize in retrospect the, quote, course of history, end quote, but to present the forms in the context in which those forms stand, quote, logically, end quote, that is, in which the forms reproduce themselves under the conditions of a particular historically concrete form of society. B. It must be determined, then, whether the state belongs amongst the essential forms of capitalist society and how it is to be developed as such. To answer the first part of the question, we must work out from the determinations of capital in general those conditions which make the genesis of a certain form necessary, a form which exists as the quote, state, end quote, alongside the other forms of capitalist reproduction. The second part of the question concerns the relations existing between the different forms, including that of the state. This means that the state must be developed not only as standing, quote, alongside and outside society, end quote, but also as a necessary form in the reproduction of the society itself. We call this procedure form analysis for short. Our attempt to outline a conceptual framework for a Marxist analysis of the state follows Marx's presentation of the forms in which the capitalist mode of production generally reproduces itself. On this level of abstraction, however, we can give only the general points of departure for the development of, quote, functions, end quote, of the process of reproduction, which must take form in such a way as to stand outside the system of privately organized labor. The question of how this formation takes place in detail, how it is transposed into structure, institution, and process of the state, can no longer be answered by form analysis. It would have to be made the subject of historical analysis. Indeed, the exact delimitation and mediation of form analysis and historical analysis raises difficult problems. It depends on how one determines the historical character of Marx's concept of capital in general. Later on, we try to come to terms with this difficulty by differentiating conceptually between system limits and activity limits in regard to the way state actions are related to the capitalist economy. Thus, we point to steps mediating the analysis of general determinations and that of specific phenomenon within a historically concrete totality. On the question of the point of departure for a derivation of the state based on the general concept of capital. Come on, I gotta get some water. Man, I must be dehydrated. That's why I'm always guzzling water. Anyway. In criticism of the hypostatization of a, quote, general concept of the bourgeois state, end quote, we point out that the economic determinations of private property as capital were not yet developed in it. Our insistence on form analysis could, however, be interpreted as containing the demand that the concept of the state should assimilate all the determinations of developed capital. However, if in what follows we set out from the commodity as the, quote, cell, end quote, or primordial form of the bourgeois mode of production, we are not concerned simply to repeat the determinations of capital in order then merely to, quote, crown, end quote, them with the state. This seems to us to be the procedure of numerous attempts at a derivation of the state. Rather, we shall try to show in these determinations of capital as a form of social relations all those moments to which the analysis of the development of the state must relate. Why we begin with the commodity and which problems can be solved in this way can best be demonstrated by a critique of previous starting points. 1. Some Marxist authors maintain that the possibility for the state to, quote, administer general interest, end quote, can be developed only from the surface of capital. On the level of, quote, simple commodity circulation, end quote, there exists as yet no contradiction between, quote, particular and general interest, end quote. Here, they claim, there exists a real equality and thus identity of interest between all subjects of exchange. To embark from a specific concept of interest, however, distorts this method's perspective on two problems. A, quote, simple commodity circulation, end quote, is no historical phase existing before or at the outset of the capitalist mode of production. It represents, rather... Oh, shirt's coming off. It's getting serious. It represents, rather, the most general surface of this mode, and is the most general form of the relation between the people socialized in this mode. It is fully developed only when labor power circulates as a commodity. B. As a result, those categories of, quote, freedom and equality, end quote, which are attributed to simple commodity circulation belong inherently to the concept of capital. They already contain the contradiction between formal equality of the commodity owner and their real inequality in the context of production. 2. A second starting point is the category of crisis, the contradiction between needs and value production, from whose dynamic of conflict there results the necessity of a different form of social organization from the structurally unconscious form mediated through the law of value. This approach to the problem seems to have the great advantage of determining the state both as organization of domination and as potential administrator of needs not satisfied by a social production governed by the law of value. However, this leaves two questions unanswered. A. The existence of these two fields of scope for action, the violent suppression of unsatisfied needs, i.e. class character, or the organization of the satisfaction of previously unsatisfied needs, i.e., quote, welfare state, end quote, character, still does not establish the existence of the state as an agent. Despite this derivation leads to a conception of the state which is based solely on categories of power relations, whereby the state assumes the character of an instrument which in the last analysis is neutral. B. Alongside the general methodological objection that the crisis cannot establish laws or forms, the crisis approach would have to explain why the normal solution to that contradiction, namely competition and crisis itself, should not suffice to clear up that contradiction. And at this point the argument must seek recourse in the category of class struggle. 3. Other authors hold, without any digression on crisis, that the category of class struggle must be the point of departure for any analysis of the bourgeois state, and indeed, following Engels, for any analysis of the, quote, class state, end quote, of which the bourgeois state is seen merely as a particular species. To this, PIcciotto posed the classical question. Quote, why does the domination of a class not continue to be that which it is? That is to say, the subordination, in fact, of one part of the population to another. Why does it take on the form of official state domination? Or, which is the same thing, why is not the mechanism of state constraint created as the private mechanism of the dominant class? Why is it dissociated from the dominant class, taking the form of an impersonal mechanism of public authority isolated from society, end quote. PIcciotto. The critique of all three approaches leads us to the social relations of commodity production, which must be made the point of departure for the analysis of the state. Freedom and equality of the subjects of exchange cannot remain categories related exclusively to the material relations of the law of value, but must constitute determined characteristics on the side of the acting subjects. Approach 1, the value form, must therefore find an adequate form on the, quote, subjective side, end quote, a form which makes possible the association of private property owners as subjects, and without their being forced to an exceptional solution of conflicts through a crisis of their relations. The, quote, separate organization of a public apparatus of coercion must have its basis also in the mutual relation of private property owners in developed form of capital owners. The state's, quote, function of domination, end quote, must therefore have a dual character. Approach 3. These arguments lead, as will be shown in the next section, to the category of the form of law. and to the necessity of a force to guarantee the law of force, which we will call extra-economic coercive force. By extra-economic coercive force, we mean not so much the organized apparatus or an instrument, but essentially only a basic function which can be derived on the conceptual level of form analysis. With that, we have by no means arrived at the, quote, state, end quote, but at different forms of social relations, namely economic and political relations, which are peculiar to the bourgeois mode of production. The divergence, the, quote, separation, end quote, of politics and economics, which, as we pointed out at the beginning, seems so obvious and easy to understand, is not a historical act which happens once, but is constantly reproduced. The question is why bourgeois society, the reproduction process of which is apparently regulated in the apparently material economic mediation of the law of value, requires an external relationship between politics and economics, since the commonplace scientific notion of the relation between politics and economics contains the assumption that only politics has to do with domination, that economics, on the other hand, has to do with, quote, material laws, end quote. We must look more closely at the specific connection in this system between domination and production. The external relationship and intermediation of politics and economies. The movement of value and the subject of law. That the fundamental function of a state as a, quote, concrete structure, end quote, is hidden in the form of the commodity, has so far occurred only to Marxist theoreticians specializing in law, but evidently a predetermined concept of the state has prevented the Marxist theoreticians specializing in law from pursuing this thread further. This is what we shall attempt to do. The movement of value as material economic nexus represents, as the form of economic societization of the producers, a type of societization free from personal physical force. The supremacy of this purely material nexus is ensured, however, by exchange as the form of societization, by price as the indicator of sociality, and by money as the sanctioning instance. Historically, however, it is true that a process necessarily precedes bourgeois society, which originally led to the, quote, depoliticization, end quote, of the economy, the abandonment of club law and of brigandage, and the subjection of the propertyless, i.e. those having become propertyless, to the relations of wage labor. It can be shown that the, quote, depoliticization, end quote, of the economy coincides with the emergence of commodity production and of money relations, and that simultaneously an increase becomes necessary to guarantee this process. Absolutism, understood in this light, is the historical phase marking the transition to the bourgeois mode of production. It is precisely the parallelism between the emergence of the money relation and of separate extra-economic coercive force, seen from the viewpoint of the bourgeoisie, that justifies the course of our analysis, which is to derive the function arising necessarily from the level of the commodity, independently of the specific concrete historical structure, here that of sovereign principalities. The material nexus of the movement of value is, however, a social relation amongst human beings. It is a feature of the capitalist mode of production that this relation assumes two different opposing forms, as a relation between things and a relation between people. The value relation, as a relationship of commodities, things to each other, exists independently of the will of the producing and, quote, communicating, end quote, beings. Value is the reified form of the sociality of their labor. It is the worker. Value is the reified form of the sociality of their labor. In value, the worker exists as nothing more than the, quote, result, end quote, than an abstract quantity of reified labor. On the other hand, the realization of value, i.e. the actual act of exchange, presupposes a conscious act of will in the commodity owner. Commodities cannot go to market by themselves, as Marx puts it. The act of exchange presupposes acting people and constitutes a relationship between acting people, albeit only as agents of circulation. Corresponding to the structure of exchange is the comparative commensuration of unequal products of labor, use value according to an abstract measure, a quantity of gold representing labor time. The exchanging parties relate to each other as different beings with different needs, all of which necessitates the formation on this plane of action of an abstract point of reference, making this commensuration possible. This point of reference is man as the subject of exchange. The decisive fact for the form of relationship between the exchanging parties is not the difference of needs, even if this difference constitutes the initial necessity of the exchange. What is decisive is that the parties take on an identical social and formal equality. This social quality is that they have a will which relates to the act of exchange and thus to all other subjects of exchange. This relationship is expressed in the form of a mutual recognition as private property owners, and thus private property as a fundamental human right and in freedom of contract. It is in this apparent freedom of the subject of exchange, in its material, economic, just as in its juridical dimension, that we find the origin of the social and political theories, as well as of common everyday notions based on categories of action. Concepts like the, quote, interaction, end quote, or, quote, social action, end quote, of individuals from whom the functional and structural nexus of society is apparently constructed, are in the pejorative sense abstractly general, and they accommodate without differentiation every kind of social relationship. We intend instead to pursue further the juridical dimension of, quote, social action, end quote, in order to reach a clarification of the basic categories of politics. Thus we shall continue to use the terminology, quote, relations of will and of law, end quote. The relations of will give rise to a system of legal relationships of right or of law as the very moment when they are agreed and fixed. Capital Volume 1 and Pashucanus. The individual assumes the form of the legal subject. The relationship between individuals become, quote, relationships expressing will between independent identical units, i.e. units between legal subjects, end quote. If the category of contract, a joint act of will founded on mutual recognition, is considered to be the original modus of law, then it is clearly a form that cannot exist without constraint. Contract itself presupposes constraint or the compulsion to perform contracts. Pacta sunt servanda. What arises, however, is no one-sided disposition over the will of another, but mutual obligation based on common agreement. With the ever-broadening nexus of exchange and thus of legal relations, the rules of exchange must be made more general, so as to provide for the equality essential to the conditions by which exchange and its law of equivalent operates. The implementation of the law of value constitutes the implementation of the rule of law. The form of law, extra-economic constraint, and politics. Thus, out of the commodity relation, as the specific reified form of the cohesion of social labor, there arises the form of law and of the legal relation, as the specific, apparently quite separate form of the relationship between isolated, quote, individuals, end quote. This provides a starting point in our conceptual derivation of extra-economic force, the, quote, legislative function, end quote, i.e. the function of formulating the law, not to be confused with the way in which the law comes into existence. Law, however, must be enforced, and its, quote, appropriate enforcement, end quote, Locke, must be guaranteed by the, quote, executive function, end quote. The guarantee of law as a basic requirement itself generates extra-economic coercion. Thus, out of the commodity form, we can derive the function of coercive force. Sanction equals formulation of law and its execution. but not as yet the state as a concrete structure. The next step in the derivation can only be the development of certain principles of form which this coercive force must observe, if this coercive force is to conform adequately to the form of the commodity. These principles are to be found in the concept of the general law, the norm, as embodying the impersonal general public quality of the law. As the specific form of commodity production separates human social relations into material relations and relations of legal persons, so the cohesion of society constitutes itself in a dual manner as abstract and, quote, suprapersonal, end quote. The material relations take place only if the subjects of law act in conformity with the movement of value. The intercourse reified in the equivalence of circulation and in the form of money demands that the subjects within this social context, A, act as towards a thing, and B, that they consciously make their own imperative of this thing. In the law there emerges on the side of the subjects the adequate form of a reified social cohesion, and the fixed, quote, positive, end quote, norms find a material sanctioning instance analogous to the function of money vis-a-vis prices, the extra economic force of coercion. This genetic relationship and structural identity between law and value also reveals itself in the parallelism pertaining to the original historical activity of the state. The fixing of weights and measures together with the ensuring of a, quote, peaceful marketplace, end quote, shows the identity of the principles of the form of the rule of law and of money. Weights and measures, as well as later the money standard, are the formal preconditions of the exchange nexus. It is precisely because the carrying through of the law of value, principally of equivalence, permits the comparative commensuration of differing value quantities that money, as the external standard of value, must be fixed, codified, and guaranteed. The first typifying feature of politics we can now identify as being relations of will, actions, quote, interactions, end quote, between independent equal subjects of law. These take the form of struggles to establish or disagreements on how to interpret rights transferred only later from the, quote, political, end quote, sphere to the separate apparatus of justice. Their content, however, is, quote, economic, end quote, i.e. dictated by movements of production and value realization. We must be clear that the abstract categories of commodity production and circulation do not disappear with the emergence of capital as the fundamental social relation. The categories of commodity production and circulation, rather, form the general categories of surface appearance. The inner changes of function emerging with capital alter nothing of this outer form. This is important in understanding the fact that the formality of law and of the state based on the rule of law, Rechtsstaat, is a functional requirement of capitalism that does not simply disappear when class structures develop. The basic form of politics, too, the struggle for law and for the instance or agency guaranteeing it, the extra economic force of coercion, is on the basis of class relations no mere illusion, but the very form in which the class struggle continuing within the bourgeois state finds political expression. Private property in the dual structure of the rule of capital. The decisive functional change in the extra economic coercive force expressed in the shift to the new function of the state, class state, occurs with the here always conceptual development of money into capital and of labor into wage labor, both being dependent on the separation of producers from the conditions of production. But here, too, we must start our analysis from the forms developed above so as not to conceptualize the function of the class state in a crude empirical way as mere brute force. The principle of equivalence in exchange and of the appropriation of products on the standard of the worker's own, quote, objectified, end quote, labor is broken with the emergence of capital. The exchange relation the exchange relations remain relations of equivalence in form, but in content, exchange relations are unequal. Labor power as a commodity is exchangeable at labor power's value, but labor power produces, by virtue of labor power's use value, a higher value which is appropriated by the capitalist in production. This new value he can then realize in circulation. On both sides of the circulation, this surplus value appears lawful. In the exchange relation between capital and wage labor, all, quote, labor, end quote, appears as paid, because the dual character of labor disappears in the form of the, quote, price of labor, end quote. In the exchange relation between capitalist and, quote, buyer, end quote. Surplus value appears as profit and is seen as a mere addition to the cost, and interpreted in totally differing ways, as a premium to recompense abstinence, as the return on the production factor capital, as the gain resulting from the situation or from business acumen, or simply to be accounted as a residual category. As the extra economic force protects commodity production's fundamental right, private property, extra economic force protects also 1. The right of capital and wage labor equally, thus also the ownership of labor power as a commodity. 2. The right of capital to the product produced in the production process. To guarantee property when that property relates to the ownership of commodities thus means to guarantee the specific form of the production process, the capital relation. All this leaves the form of the law unaffected. It bears no mark of a change of function. It bears no mark of a change of function. Formally, property equals property, and that too is no, quote, illusion, end quote. Extra economic force also protects the right of ownership of labor power. In effect, however, to protect the ownership of capital also means to protect the rule of capital over wage labor in the process of production of value. This rule, however, has now split itself into two, into a purely material form, the pre-political rule of the conditions of production as capital over the producers on the one side, and an abstract general public, i.e. political rule, on the other. The doubling of social rule finds the doubling of social rule's expression in the separation between private and public law, between the law in the narrow sense relating to the reproduction of bourgeois society, a law which pivots around private property, and the law relating to the structure and jurisdictional competence of public rule. This division of bourgeois law in the wider sense into apparent independent areas makes the relationship of economics to politics appear even more external. The protection of private property and thus private property itself are seen as being so objective and neutral that it becomes necessary to uncover the points of conflict from which we can interpret the activity of the extra economic coercive force as functioning in the sense of capital, and thus the political rule as functioning in the sense of capital as class rule. The development of these points of conflict is important because in the slovenly formulations of many Marxist theories of the state, quote, the functionality of the state for capital by virtue of its essential nature, end quote, is so taken for granted that the exact analysis of the struggles, conflicts, and crises concerning the changing forms of state, in the narrower sense of government systems, is no longer possible. First, we shall deal with the movement of conflict. First, we shall deal with the moments of conflict, and then, retracing our steps, analyze the way in which the extra economic force of coercion affects the varying categories of private property owners. Legal relations and class conflict. Yeah, I always have this thing where I'm like, did I start recording or did I not? Well, hopefully my computer's not a little bastard. But God only knows. Legal relations and class conflict. A. From the character of labor as a commodity, there results a fundamental breach of the borderline between purely material relations and relations of legal persons, which through a long process of mediation are also political relations. This breach renders impossible any attempts at delimitation based on any kind of systems theory. The owners of the commodity labor power carry it together with the commodity themselves as concrete beings onto the market. Figuratively, the worker as legal subject remains forever in circulation, never entering the factory, never shouted at by a foreman, sitting besuited in his car before the factory gates. The worker as concrete being puts on his blue overalls and becomes the, quote, factor of production, end quote. A material function within the system of capital production, he acquires the form of variable capital. As such a factor, he is subservient to the rule of capital. The voluntary act of exchange has become a one-sided subjection to an alien will. The, quote, voluntariness, end quote, of the worker as legal subject is based on his compulsion to sell his labor power as a concrete being so as to reproduce his life. B. The legal guarantee of property and capital guarantees not only the rule of every individual capitalist over his workers, but also the reproduction of the legal relations of capital, in that it safeguards the accumulation of capital, legally ensured in the right of free disposal over existing and newly realized ownership of value. C. The value of the commodity labor power is not determined in the same way as the value of other commodities. All other commodities represent only a certain quantity of, quote, objectified or, quote, dead labor. The reproduction of the commodity labor power is, however, the life process of the concrete being with his concrete needs. The value of this commodity, i.e. the quantity of indispensable necessaries required to maintain life, must always be a matter for struggle. See Capital Volume 1, Chapter 10, The Working Day. D. The saleability of the commodity labor power depends on the conditions of the market as a reflection of the accumulation process. This dependence seems to have the same material, quote, natural, end quote, form as that of any other commodity. If, however, other commodities perish, the labor incorporated in those commodities was in vain. When the commodity labor power perishes, it is a man himself who perishes. All these factors create conflict, the result not of the objective movement of capital, even if conditioned by the objective movement of capital, but of the working class's claim to the right to live. These conflicts, i.e. class conflicts, express themselves in historically varying ways, but they are nevertheless the fundamental conflicts from which the relationship of, quote, politics to, quote, economics is determined. This relationship has now become an external relationship, and our analysis must therefore pursue the mode in which the forms affect each other as external and trace the general features of their effect on the class relations within production. We must also show the forms of mediation in which extra-economic coercive force can bring itself to bear on the material aspect of the reproduction of capital. On the dual effect of law in bourgeois society. The abstract and apparently, quote, neutral, end quote, character of the extra-economic force at the level of the forms of circulation proves, when we analyze how it affects people, legal persons, according to their class position, to be no longer neutral but related to the capital relation. A. Insofar as law lays down only the procedures necessary to ensure the operation of the law of value. It regulates the process of circulation by guaranteeing that the subjects behave in accordance with the demands of the material economic process. In circulation, the subjects are called upon to behave as the mere, quote, character masks, end quote, of the relations implied by this process. The formal character of law applies in effect not to its subjects but to things. Accordingly, someone who possesses property is protected not as a person but as the owner of commodities, etc. This protection applies to 1. The right of free movement of things above all capital, freedom in the sense of, quote, independence from an alien will, end quote. Here has the economic function of making the piece of property free to adapt to the workings of the law of value, to be sold or invested in this way or that way, etc. 2. The equality which here emerges as a principle of law is in effect the equality of treatment, abstract equal validity of every commodity corresponding to the principle of equivalence in exchange. Here, too, the principle applies not to the concrete person, but to the legal subject as a necessary category of commodity production. Through this subject, it applies to the labor materialized in the commodity, to the precise quantity of labor in each case, which in the process of comparison effected on the market gives the commodity that commodity's value, and thus that commodity's exchangeability. This is the law of circulation. Freedom and equality applied in this sense to labor power leads necessarily to the proscribing of workers' combinations, as happened in the 19th century, and in the USA still in the 20th century, or alternatively to the political and economic, quote, recognition, end quote, of such combinations at the same time as relying on their ineffectiveness when confronted with market laws. B. In terms of production, the law of private property applies to the right to conform to the objective movement of the law of value in the private production process, through reorganization, technical change, increase in productivity, and this not merely formally, but through the flexible, free conduct of affairs. Here, labor power counts no longer as the fine, free legal subject, but rather as a factor of production with which the property owner can do as he wishes. Although the property owner's, quote, will, end quote, is conditioned by the objective movement of the economy. In the worker's eyes, this movement divests itself of its pure, quote, objectivity, end quote, and confronts him as the direct rule of capital. Here we see that for the worker, freedom and equality in the production process are once again suspended. C. Insofar as, quote, freedom, end quote, and, quote, equality, end quote, as rights were from the beginning not merely functional and economic terms, but were citizens' rights connecting legal subjects with extra economic coercive force, appearing at first only in the form of subjection, then later in the form of the right to political participation and to share in the services provided by the state. These rights concealed within themselves a danger for the bourgeois system. Understood as the claims of concrete human beings, human rights, they constitute to some extent the legitimating point at which class struggle can break into, quote, politics, end quote. This is true in that people derive from the rights to, quote, freedom, end quote, equality, end quote, the right to fight for their, quote, interest, end quote, as well as the right to aim beyond the system of the bourgeois mode of production. This feature inherent in the legally constituted state, Rechtsstaat, is of vital importance. Emphasis on this, however, should not lead to a naive contraposition of, quote, state based on the rule of law, end quote, Rechtsstaat, to, quote, class state, end quote, Klassenstaat. Instead, we must first analyze the dual effect of the bourgeois legal state, which protects, quote, private property owners, end quote, generally as well as property in the form of capital. Extra economic coercion is class coercion. We can now attempt to determine the character of the extra economic coercive force as class coercion in general. A. In relation to the commodity nexus and to the commodity owners as legal subjects, the extra economic force is no more than a neutral, quote, third, end quote, force like money standing over the exchange parties. Abstract equality is its precondition, and thus its effect can only be an identical one for everyone. This is expressed in the concept that law is formulated as general principles, that the general norm is the form of law. B. In relation to the reproduction of capital, the extra economic coercive force guarantees not just the possibility of buying and selling, but also the compulsion to sell resulting from the division of the producers from the conditions of production. It guarantees the reign of capital in the private production process, i.e., the unrestricted employment of labor power for the purpose of producing surplus value. The first guarantee protects the relation of capital in general, the second, the particular area of operation of individual capitals. C. By this analysis of how law and extra economic coercive force operate, we have in effect developed this concept of the, quote, particularization of the state, end quote. We have shown why the, quote, state, end quote, as a concrete structure constitutes in essence a general force of coercion which confronts even the individual bourgeois, individual competing capital, as a separated neutral instance, but which at the same time, and only through this separation, is, by virtue of its existence, as a central force guaranteeing the law, a class force. Precisely in order to be a class force, the state must dissociate or, quote, particularize itself, end quote, sich besondern, from the ruling class. The basic form of social relations as mediating forms and limitations on extra economic interventions in the process of reproduction. Before we investigate the points of departure for an analysis of the structure of the state, we wish briefly to specify the forms through which extra economic interventions are mediated and their limitations. We have established that in a commodity-producing society, certain basic forms of social relations emerge. Of these we can say, A. The material economic relations present themselves as monetary relations between people. B. Relations between the subjects of exchange take on the form of legal relations. One moment. Okay, so I'm intending to cut the last 3 minutes from the last part of the recording because it's fucking, my computer froze up. But if I didn't, I'm sorry for that long interruption. But at least you found out that my mom did in fact pee herself today, which is great information. We have established that in a commodity-producing society, certain basic forms of social relations emerge. Of these we can say, A. The material economic relations present themselves as monetary relations between people. B. Relations between the subjects of exchange take on the form of legal relations. The extra economic coercive force always bases the extra economic coercive force's actions on the specific monetary and or legal form of social relations, or creates such social relations for the purpose of its interventions. This means, however, that these attempts to intervene do not directly and immediately shape the relations between the social classes, particularly in the sphere of private production, but are mediated through the basic forms. The analysis of the form of law and of the extra economic coercive force showed that actions stemming from this force and mediated through law, 1. Have different effects on the legal subjects according to their position in the reproductive process. 2. Can only take effect on the reproductive process from outside, mediated through the legal subjects. Extra economic force thus, quote, regulates, end quote, the material relations of reproduction externally by establishing standards or norms for behavior. Only where private property owners are legal subjects, in their relations within circulation, are private property owners subject to the force of the state. In their private sphere, where their property is at their disposal, they are beyond the reach of state authority. Just as in law, what in money appears as an external, quote, limitation, end quote, can be seen to be nothing other than the autonomization of forms resulting from the laws of capitalist commodity production. Money as the externalized form of the reproductive process shows the limitations of the, quote, state, end quote, in two respects. One, quote, state monetary policy, end quote, in all its different spheres affects the subjects as money owners, not in their function in the process of reproduction. From this direction, too, the impact on the classes is a varying impact, even although the form of, quote, state, end quote, activity is the same. 2. Actions vis-a-vis the money owner through the medium of money affect the process of reproduction only externally. Although limitations or demands implemented through, quote, monetary policy, end quote, do have effects on the behavior in the reproduction process of those affected, quote, the qualitative content of this effect is something that is not subject to the active will of the state, something that is an inherent part of the bourgeois subject's freedom of decision and thus subjected to the laws and process of competition, end quote. Vert, 1973. Two objections could be raised, however, to this argument concerning the immediate nature of extra economic intervention. 1. That the bourgeois state is constituted first and foremost as a coercive force intervening directly, end quote, regulating, end quote, class relations. On no account will we deny that the open and indeed in certain circumstances terroristic use of state force is and has been an actual occurrence and always a possibility. But it is, seen in terms of our general analysis, quote, only, end quote, force, proceeding from the bonds of the legal relations which we have already analyzed. Furthermore, this force lies at the basis of legal relations as a guaranteeing force. It is the same justice and the same police, even if through different branches, that tracks down and sentences both traffic offender and, quote, radical, end quote. This is not contradicted, but rather is confirmed by the fact, as class conflicts become increasingly institutionalized in law, even in the direct use of force, the state does and must increasingly ensure that the state's actions respect legal formality. 2. That the state also or principally develops out of the necessity to provide, quote, general material conditions of reproduction, end quote, and that in this it acts under its own responsibility and is competent for its own organization, i.e., it acts directly without mediation. We do not see in this objection any argument against the view that extra economic interventions in relation for the process of reproduction are in principle mediated and limited. For a. the, quote, state, end quote, in pursuing such concerns often does not function as a state, but as a individual capital. State-run enterprises of very many kinds. B. the, quote, organization, end quote, of certain services, such as education, is in fact characterized by its mediated relationship to the reproductive process, hence the difficulties in evaluating its function for capital, as the whole Marxist debate over further education has shown. However, this cannot finally and comprehensively serve to determine the limitations on the extra economic force of coercion in the extra economic force of coercion's relation to the process of capital reproduction. We must attempt to show the, quote, limitations of the state in the capitalist system, end quote, from two sides, that of the economic process as material process of the movement of value in the form of capital, and that of class relations insofar as class relations present themselves as relations between, quote, legal subjects, end quote. The state and the movement of capital. We must again recall the limits of what can be done at the level of the analysis of form. The investigation of the quote general end quote and the quote communal end quote, prompted by commodity circulation as the specific form of societization and general surface of society covering over even the capital relation, leads to the establishment of a social function which must be formed, quote, alongside and outside, end quote, the special interest contained in the exchange relation. The question of how this function is institutionalized lies beyond the scope of this conceptual level, and is, as we have said above, the subject of the historical analysis of the genesis of the bourgeois state. What is important is that the function is organized and finds a corresponding structure and thus an agent of action in society. The limit to form analysis consists in the fact that, although the possibility of the realization of this, quote, state function, end quote, is established, the necessity for it is not. The limit to analysis is familiar to us from the derivation of crisis, the general possibility of which can be demonstrated even on the level of commodity exchange, but the necessity for which cannot be conceptually determined, despite the further development in the presentation of the concept of capital, and despite the fact that the conditions for its possibility are developed with increasing specificity. Here, as we see it, there is a fundamental difficulty in the discussion of the state. It is true that we have described the interrelationship between the mode of production and one of the mode of production's functions, a function presupposing an organization, quote, alongside and outside, end quote, buyers and sellers as parties to exchange. But we have not derived the state, which in our understanding contains a multiplicity of connections with and functions for the process of reproduction. This is, however, overlooked if one starts out from a general concept of the state. If one starts from such a concept, the competence for certain functions is to some extent accounted for a priori. We intend to demonstrate the consequences of such a concept by looking at some approaches to a Marxist analysis of the state, which we have already in part cited in connection with the dialectic of state and society. The intention of these approaches is to, quote, derive, end quote, systematically the relationship between the state and the economic process of reproduction, and thus to establish how, quote, the state, end quote, can at all exist as a particular social form, and why the state indeed must exist as such. Three attempts at a derivation of the state and their respective determination of the functions of the state. A. Flatto and Huisken, 1973, insist quite rightly that both questions must be answered. They themselves establish the possibility of the formal particularization of the state for the existence of a particular, quote, sphere of statehood, Staatlichkeit, which crystallizes out in the structures of problems and consciousness on the, quote, surface of bourgeois society, end quote. The substance of this sphere comprises the, quote, general interest, end quote, of those drawing incomes, interests, which, regardless of the different, quote, sources, end quote, of the incomes, are general and equal as far as the maintenance of the preconditions guaranteeing the incomes is concerned. The content of the concept of, quote, general interest, end quote, is for Flatto and Huisken constituted by all that the individuals as owners of a particular source of income have in common, but including also the owners of other sources of income insofar as they share interests other than those conditioned by the material nature of the source of income. Security of the source of income against theft, exhaustion, etc. The guarantee of economic growth as precondition of the highest possible income for all. The harmonious crisis-free functioning of reproduction to ensure continuity of income. The category of, quote, general interest, end quote, already conceptually includes the entire empirical gambit of state functions. Thus Flatto and Huisken see, quote, general, end quote, as applying to everything from a characteristic of the form of law. Flatto and Huisken view this on the level of the agent, the property owner, to a designation for the common interest of any, almost arbitrarily composed group. Thus they believe that in explaining the state in terms of the dialectic of general and particular interests, they are deriving the necessity of the state's form, independently of the content of specific state functions, because the individual property owners are by definition concerned only with their particular interest, and because, on the other hand, the pursuit of these particular interests presupposes the realization of general interests. An instance must emerge which is responsible for these general interests. It is, however, merely a question of definition to say that the pursuit of particular interest excludes the realization of general interests. Marx's presentation of competition shows precisely that the realization of general interest is the unconscious and unsought result of the actions of individual private property owners. The essential point in this derivation, however, seems to be that the contradiction between general and particular interest is used to establish the, quote, doubling of society into society and state, end quote, and that this state is already a functionally fully determined form. The state is, as it were, merely in search of the general interest which the state has to realize. Concerning their derivation of the form of the state, Flatto and Huisken point out that, quote, a methodological constraint to come to a general derivation of specific state activities no longer exists in our context, end quote. The view, correct in our opinion, that specific functions of the state cannot be derived from the general concept of capital, is argued by Flatto and Huisken by way of a pure dialectic of concepts. For all these state activities immanent solely from the concept of the general interest, they are, as it were, and in our formulation, nothing more than the historically real outer manifestations of the, quote, essence, end quote, of the bourgeois state. Quote, the functions of the state, i.e. the areas to which state policies relate and which appear in the division into departments and ministries, a thesis which Flatto and Huisken do not follow up, do not constitute the essence of the bourgeois state. Rather, the full spectrum of these areas can only be analyzed if one sets out from the concept of the bourgeois state. But because the concept of the state characterizes its form, it at the same time encapsulates the general conditions for the genesis of the functions of the state, the administration of the general interest. A fatal result of this way of determining the essence of the state is that contradictions in the state's activity in fulfilling its possible functions can no longer be explained from the general features of the state. Such contradictions are then correspondingly removed by Flatto and Huisken to the empirical level. They speak of the, quote, heterogeneity of the empirical actions of the bourgeois state, whilst it is, quote, general, end quote, in state activity, whilst what is, quote, general, end quote, in state activity asserts itself only through these heterogeneous empirical elements, a merely linguistic analogy to the oscillation of prices around value. B. In contrast to the attempt to explain the essence of the bourgeois state from the structure of the surface of bourgeois society, the, quote, Projekt Klassenanalyse, end quote, derives the state directly from the system of social division of labor and the contradiction between the material demands of social production and their bourgeois form as private labor. The Projekt Klassenanalyse sees the necessity of the state as arising from the apparently naturally given fact that labor functions exist, quote, which a priori are communal, end quote, and which thus, by definition, cannot be realized through the unconscious mediated form of social organization. The state is therefore allocated its place as functional agent of society in the making and securing of the, quote, general conditions of production, end quote. In this way, the formation of the state, quote, solves, end quote, as the authors of the Projekt Klassenanalyse rightly express it, the contradiction between communal and indirectly, i.e., not immediately, social functions. The construction of an, quote, a priori communality, end quote, peculiar to certain labor functions is seen to be deficient as soon as the attempt is made to use it as a criterion for differentiation within the division of labor. The criterion given by the authors is tautological. All forms of labor are considered communal, with, quote, which, quote, directly serve to accomplish communal tasks, and which thus cannot be performed under the form of labor that is only indirectly social, end quote. We can also see that in the following, quote, derivation, end quote, of the state by Engels, quoted by the authors of Projekt Klassenanalyse, only the problem, but not its solution, is to be found. Quote, the matter can be most easily grasped from the point of view of the division of labor. Society creates certain communal functions which it cannot do without. The people appointed to implement them form a new branch of division of labor within society. This means that they represent certain interests vis-a-vis their mandatories. They grow independent of them, and the state is there. And the same thing happens as with commodity and later with money exchange, end quote. Letter from Engels to Conrad Schmidt. But why is it the state that emerges and not a new branch of social production within the capital relation? The question remains unanswered as to why the state assumes a priori certain tasks, and why capital should not be in the position to develop forms which do justice to the specific character of labor, of course in its own way, i.e. by conforming without any plan or awareness to necessities of the system which confront it in the form of, quote, bottlenecks, end quote, barriers of the production and circulation processes. Without wishing to overtax its use as evidence, we must here refer to the so-called, quote, road building example, end quote, from the Grundrisse, where Marx assumed a regression of state production functions in the areas commonly counted among the, quote, general conditions of production, end quote, to the extent which capital developed socially. And we must point out that Marx considered the formation of limited companies, for example, to be a means by which capitalist forms of socialization adapted themselves to tasks that could no longer be solved with the old forms of organization. What is essential to our argument, however, is the fact that for Projekt Klassenanalyse, too, the doubling of society into society and state establishes the state from the start, without any mediation in a definite form that is functional for capital. In the Projekt Klassenanalyse, there emerges a very simple chain of argument. If the relation of capitalist production by its very nature implies social domination, and if the state guarantees it the necessary, quote, general framework conditions, end quote, then the state is proved to be by its very nature repressive. The ruling class can use the state as the ruling class's instrument. C. A third possible derivation of the state has been developed by Altvater, 1973. Altvater, too, explains the necessity of the form of the state from the relationship between the bourgeois form of the socialization of production and the objective demands of social organization which cannot be realized in its bourgeois form. Alongside competition, the state is functionally necessary for total social reproduction. Capital, says Altvater, quote, requires as capital's base at capital's base, a special institution which is not subject to capital's limitations as capital. A special institution whose transactions are not determined by the necessity of producing surplus value. A special institution which is, in this sense, a special institution, quote, alongside and outside bourgeois society, end quote, and one which at the same time provides on the undisputed basis of capital itself the imminent necessities that capital neglects. Consequently, bourgeois society produces in the state a specific form which expresses the average interest of capital, end quote. As with Projektklassenanalyse's derivation, the state steps in, as it were, alongside competition, which Altvater describes more precisely as being capitalist, in order to perform the necessary tasks which the other form of socialization cannot accomplish. However, to the extent that the state is obliged, here due to capital's limitations, not to predetermined factors arising from the material nature of these tasks, to take them over, there results not merely a dualism or juxtaposition, which would imply no restrictions on the task assumed by each side, but an actual contradiction. Although the state is not subject to the limitations of capital as capital, the state limitations grow out of its specific relationship to capital. The needs to take over certain tasks results here from the, quote, possibilities and limitations, end quote, of capital. Quote, what the general conditions of production are depends precisely on what cannot, within a given historical situation, be taken over by capital itself, end quote. The, quote, definition, end quote, of the general conditions of production in relation to the level of accumulation and the conditions of valorization erases the difference between them and those social labor functions which, because of the movement of the social rate of profit, can no longer serve as a sphere of capital investment. That is, the difference between state functions when capital is scarce and when capital is abundant. His historical relativization does not mean that Altvater introduces the state as a factor of pure historical contingency. While the system of social labor contains no indication as to which task must in their nature be performed, quote, alongside and outside, end quote, the system of particular interest, Altvater's argument leads to the conclusion that it is the state's general function to undertake, should the necessity arise, the tasks involved at any given time. In a certain sense, the contributions of von Flatto and Huysken, the, quote, Projektklassenanalyse, end quote, group, and of Altvater provide three logical possibilities for deriving the state from an imminent contradiction in capitalist socialization. While the first authors focus on the contradiction between private property and the general conditions of private property's existence, formulated on the level of interest, and the second on that between unconsciously social and communal production, both starting from the level of commodity production, Altvater specifies the contradiction between capitalist socialization and the material demands of production, and thus takes capital as his starting point. As regards the determination of the limits of state intervention, the external relation to the movement of capital, the form fixation, the movement of rates of profit, etc., and the forms in which these limits appear, stagflation, armaments, budgets, etc., we agree broadly with Altvater, although we shall try to express the determination of these limits as a problem of method more precisely and systematically. We are here chiefly concerned with showing that it is characteristic of all three variants that whatever the root contradiction, the result of the derivation is always the, quote, state, end quote, as a fully determined form, a form which in its turn is seen as the essence of the state and thus already embryonically contains all the state's functions, responsibilities, and possibilities of action. The points of relation for the functions of the state. In contrast, we deem it of crucial importance not to approach the problem of the individual functions of the state on the basis of a general concept of the bourgeois state, however determined, but to analyze these functions individually in relation to the process of the reproduction of capital. It is important, therefore, in determining the off-cited, quote, possibilities and, quote, limitations of the state in relation to its freedom to mold social structures, not to fall into the vicious circle in which every activity of the state is no more than a manifestation of a determination already contained in the state's, quote, essence, end quote, a determination which can thus operate only within boundaries prescribed by this essence. We have uncovered, as the result of the, quote, division, end quote, of politics and economy, the condition for the existence of an extra-economic instance, and this engenders the abstract possibility of an intervention from, quote, outside, end quote, in the spontaneously socialized process of society's material reproduction. The realization of this possibility requires careful historical empirical analysis, reconstructing conceptually the genesis of each of its functions. This would trace the process by which they are detached from particular stages of the reproduction of capital, the conditions which prevent their being carried out as matters of specific private concerns, their centralization and institutional consolidation, as a structure which then becomes a moment of the historically specific state. Even though this process cannot be anticipated by form analysis, this process can nevertheless be used to systematize the points of insertion given as available to the state when the state relates as an external instance to the process of reproduction of capital, and this allows us to ascertain some basic characteristics of this external relation. The process of reproduction must present itself in a dual manner to the extra-economic instance, A, as an economic process mediated in an apparently objective manner, B, a system of social relationships. This dual appearance only expresses the condition of existence of that instance, which we have described above as the, quote, division, end quote, of politics and economy. A, in his presentation of capital as maintaining and expanding itself through motion, i.e. in the metamorphosis of the circuit of a single capital, and in the interweaving of circuits and forms of circuits of the many capitals. Marx uses the category, quote, functional forms, end quote, in order to draw attention to one particular problem. Reproduction occurs through forms which capital must assume in capital's various stages of production and circulation. Forms which, although related functionally, as forms of capital, to the total process, are, as forms, subject to their own conditions. Quote, functional form, end quote, implies both the inner connection and the external lack of connection of the reproduction process, and thus the, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, of the individual form of capital, the possibility of their autonomization. Marx describes the functional form of, quote, industrial capital, end quote, corresponding to the stages of circulation as money, commodity, and means of production / labor as the factors of production. Suffice it merely to mention that if examined more closely, and if these functions of capital were included that differ from those of industrial capital, these forms would increase significantly in number. The important point is that the state relates to reproduction through these forms, and that the forms of the production stage acquire, through private property, a particular state-free status. Money has been characterized by us as a form of mediation of state interventions. Vis-a-vis capital, it is a point of insertion, but only from the perspective of capital is it a functional form, which can therefore be understood only from its context or interconnections. The way that functions with a specific form operate, in the case of money, its function as medium of circulation that was a burpsy. The way that functions with a specific form operate, in the case of money, its functions as medium of circulation, means of payment, and reserve fund. In the case of the commodity, money's function of realization is not obvious with reference to their functions for capital. Thus, shortage of money, with the corresponding phenomena in the money form, can, quote, indicate, end quote, completely different, even contrary movements in the reproduction of capital. Marx has described in detail the confusion which this caused in England's banking legislation and monetary policy in the first half of the 19th century. The results of G. Lindner's analysis of the policies of the German Federal Bank can be understood in a similar manner. As regards the historical development of attempts at regulation by the state, we can at this point surmise that these are fixated on individual forms, on the basis of the historically experienced tendencies towards autonomization of these very forms, which thus also come to be seen as possible cause of crisis, or as a factor of control, and that ranges of instruments, criteria of intervention, and theories of crisis have been developed corresponding to these form-specific functions. Policy thus fixed in form must necessarily reinforce appearances, i.e. strengthen still more, or, quote, consolidate, end quote, politically, these tendencies towards autonomization. A further thesis might be derived from the manner in which such form-fixed state functions are institutionalized. The state structure would have to be understood as a complex system of policies with only an apparent external unity, which are by and large initially linked independently of one another to the movement of capital, and are only subsequently more or less brought together. For, quote, less, end quote, see the status of the Federal Bank and the various organizational forms of state concerns. These policies, which orient themselves, as have been shown, to the forms in which reproduction is expressed, can contradict or duplicate one another in an unforeseen manner. In the last resort, they lead to haphazardly regulated results. For the inner connection of these policies, their logic lies outside their formal unity, the state. It lies in the movement of capital. B. Just as the state relates, in the matter of material forms, to those of the sphere of circulation, so too in the matter of social relations. It has already been shown how the state relates to individuals, seeing individuals as subjects of law, and as formally free and equal subjects of the market, and imposing on them only their own abstract will. Now we cannot separate the, quote, material, end quote, and the, quote, social, end quote, relations of the state to reproduction in such a way that the state intervenes via the first, and via the second only guarantees the laws of appropriation of private property. When it does not employ the material form of money, the state intervenes by dragooning the legal subjects even when the object of the intervention is the material interrelations. At this point, the, quote, system limit, end quote, inherent in state measures, interventions, functions, is revealed, a limit which, as we shall see, is formed in the last resort by that social relation which also constitutes a functional form of capital, the social relation between labor power and means of production, between living and objectified dead labor in production. Private property, and thus the social relations of the sphere of circulation, forms of system limit, private property, and thus the social relations of the sphere of circulation, forms a system limit only in the wider sense. This system limit One second. This system limit does indeed characterize the formal independence of the sphere of reproduction, but only the formal independence, for there is no doubt that the state intervenes in the sphere of private property, particularly in times of crisis, When the state forces the working class to sell their labor power at a certain price and thus suspends the working class's right, resulting from the ownership of their labor power, to their own conceptions of price. The system limit in the narrower sense is production as the functional form of capital and capital's, quote, material metamorphosis, end quote, in contrast to the purely formal metamorphoses of circulation. When the state intervenes at the source of production of surplus value, the state infringes the limit critical to the survival of the system, the withholding of investment, the removal of production to other countries, the withdrawal of capital are spectacular forms of reaction against each intervention. A critical position is already reached if, for example, anything more than symbolic price controls are attempted, in analogy to wage restrictions. In contrast to wage labor, capital is very well able to steer against this type of intervention with such measures as production cutbacks, demands for compensation, pressures on the working class, and many more. When price controls affect property rights, the equality of such state interventions vis-a-vis capital and labor is merely formal. The system limit is fixed by the form determinations developed out of the relation of capitalist production, and it can therefore be derived in the level of form analysis. Discussion of the limits of state autonomy of action must, however, be concretized on the analytical level of historical movement, which we reach in the next section. The state and class movement. System limit and limit of activity. From the external relation of the, quote, state, end quote, to the economic process, we determined hypothetically two features which characterize its functional activity. One, the necessary reference to forms whose functional interrelation within the reproduction of capital is not transparent and which, on the contrary, are themselves atomized and give a false indication of the conditions and requirements of state activity. A high interest rate can indicate good conditions of valorization or merely a need for means of payment. A steady flow of commodities can mean good opportunities for realization or simply stockpiling by commercial capital. 2. The theoretical fixation, problem perception on, and observation of particular forms leads to opposing policies, since these policies are elaborated within a state structure which is itself a conglomeration of institutionalized functions. These two features impose on state action, quote, activity limits, end quote, over and above the actual, quote, system limit, end quote. The system limit can be specified on the level of form determinations. Activity limits can only be specified on the level of historical movement. We cannot here undertake to determine a limit of activity for a particular state with respect to particular functions. Instead, we shall analyze more closely the limit of activity, which in our eyes is the decisive and final one. The core and thus, quote, state-free, end quote, process of the capitalist mode of production is the, quote, material metamorphosis, end quote, of capital in the process of production. That is, the process in which not only the substance of the distribution process is generated, but also in which primary distribution is already decided upon. The measures taken by the state as, quote, framework conditions, end quote, of reproduction in the areas of money, trade, foreign trade, economic law, etc., are indeed for individual capitals more or less connected with this central process. But they are basically no more than attempts to regulate that which the process of capital, quote, controls, end quote. The question of the activity limits of the state, whether in the attempt to help capitalist reproduction to continue in the face of capitalist reproduction's own barriers, or in the attempt to limit the controlling freedom of capital in a manner which, quote, transcends the system, end quote, must be answered by reference to the conditions of surplus value production. As soon, however, as constellations emerge or state measures are taken which infringe this central process of capital, its relevance manifests itself. Capital reacts in a spectacular form by investment strikes, inflation, etc. Alternatively, when the workers' class struggle, whether confined to the plant or not, restricts capital's, quote, freedom to control, end quote, the state reasserts, if need be, in equally spectacular fashion, the right of capital. If we stress the process of production, of surplus value as the decisive moment in determining the activity limit, and not the rate of profit or conditions of accumulation, etc., which are singled out by most Marxist authors, it is because a functioning process of exploitation in production and the possibility of its extension and intensification, i.e. high rates of profit, high surplus product also for political disposal, alleviate all the state's governmental problems. Quite the opposite is the case where the extension and intensification encounters resistance. The decisive and final limit of state activity is thus set by the working class through it. The decisive and final limit of state activity is thus set by the working class, although it is to some degree first felt and politically transmitted by capital on the basis of falling profits and worsening conditions of accumulation. We maintain in this context that the limit of state activity will differ depending on whether this state activity is directed at wage labor or capital as the object of intervention. The state can intervene in the rights of the working class with considerably more force from the point of view of form, because the working class's rights are only covered very generally by private property. Such instances of intervention, however, themselves have limits in the functions of the capitalist reproduction process, where an intervention mediated through the regulation of working class rights affects the system of capital reproduction too. Since labor power functions as a form of capital in the reproduction process of capital, all attempts to intervene in the rights of the person result, because in labor, power, person, and thing cannot be separated in affecting the movement of the thing. Thus, the restriction of working class mobility, as for example in fascism, can lead to the capital represented by variable capital being regulated dysfunctionally for the reproduction process of capital. Problems can arise when the elimination of the labor market means that the composition of the capital mass, variable capital, can no longer be regulated in terms of quantity and quality training according to the demands of the process of valorization. The asymmetry of the limit of activity with regard to capital and labor is a birthmark of the bourgeois state. Quote, negatively, end quote, i.e. directed against capital, the limit of the system is soon reached. Quote, positively, end quote, i.e. directed against wage labor, intervention is determined only according to the limit, which the working class can erect in accordance with the historical phase of the class constellations. And this, in fact, is the decisive historical moment in the investigation of the state's limits of activity. Of course, this case cannot be separated from the conditions of accumulation and the degree of socialization of labor. Periods of dictatorial rule through the bourgeois state can, however, easily create, quote, unevennesses, end quote, as the German example shows, so that these last mentioned conditions, which derive from the level of the productive forces and the historical conditions of valorization, are bad indicators of the class constellation. We believe that in characterizing capitalism according to periods, particularly where such problems as the relative autonomy of the state are concerned, one must focus on the features of the long-term, firmly delimited class constellation, rather than on features which in the last resort must depend on market structures, competitive and monopoly capitalism, etc. Class constellation as limit of activity. A. At this point, the concept of the surface of the capitalist process of reproduction becomes relevant. A. At this point, the concept of the surface of the capitalist process of reproduction becomes relevant, a concept employed particularly by Plato and Huysken in their derivation of the bourgeois state. We believe we have shown that the conceptual derivation of the state cannot begin at this point. However, the quote surface end quote now becomes relevant since we are concerned with the historical constitution of state functions. Class relations in capitalist society are not merely concealed by the equality and freedom of the private property owners arising from the forms of simple commodity circulation discussed at the beginning of this study. Rather, they actually appear on the surface of developed competition as the relations between the factors of production and the owners of sources of revenue, i.e., recipients of incomes. These surface figurations must be analyzed before the attempt is made to reconstruct the constitution of state functions, and thus of the real state, out of the class constellation. However, because they neglect the form of law, Plato and Huysken overlook that this constitution is in fact the result of an historical process. The owner of labor power, as a free wage laborer with the full and equal rights of citizens, was able to develop only through long class struggles. In no way does he arise from the surface forms of competition, for in these forms the private property owner always remains an economic category. The emergence of a political subject of law corresponding to this economic category, the quote worker citizen end quote, is accomplished in the shape of class struggles, because surface categories always constitute mere formal equality, while the material inequality posited in the production of surplus value continually calls this apparent equality into question. Working class resistance must develop out of the relations of domination in production, and with regard to the state, assume certain structures which mark out the framework of state activity. B. We should like here, albeit sketchily and on the basis of German history, to characterize the different phases which establish specific, quote, possibilities and limits, end quote, for state activity. First phase. Here the relation of capital to labor appears as corresponding to the general concept of capital. The worker's full sovereignty over his commodity, labor power in the exchange process, is transformed into the total sovereignty of capital in the production process. In the organization of this process, capital acts with such disrespect for its limits that it endangers its own source of reproduction. The limits which capital was set after the struggle for the 8-hour day are nothing but the safeguard of one of capital's functional forms against the logic of capital itself. Insofar as the state enforces this safeguard, the state is a, quote, ideal total capitalist, end quote, a formula which should be used, if at all, only to derive the content of state action from state action's results. It must not serve as a concept of, quote, essence, end quote, to imply that the state's activity depends on the extent to which the state is an ideal total capitalist. With this guarantee, the working class has won the right to life as separate individuals based on the sale of their commodity labor power. The state manifests itself as a class state when labor power revolts against labor power's functional character as capital, as a factor of production, and thus at the same time infringes the law. Second phase. Workers' coalitions, trade unions, and the like are recognized by capital and by the state. The working class has won for itself the right to organize. The legalization of trade unions initiates an increasing tendency towards legal formalization of the relations between capital and labor, now as a collective subject of law, and towards the institutionalization of class struggle. Although we cannot here go into the process by which working class forms of organization are legalized, We shall nevertheless make some remarks about the necessity of this development with regard to capital reproduction, so as to avoid the impression that this movement is based merely on political power constellations. The legalization of the trade unions and the legal formalization of the social conflicts between capital and labor were the precondition for a social truce which had become indispensable for the reproduction and development of capital. The reason for this is not only that the working class acknowledges the, quote, system limit, end quote, through the institutionalization of class conflict, and that its struggles lose the character of a negation of the capitalist mode of production. Indeed, in the first phase, open repression already served as the alternative to a political integration of the working class. The essential point is that with the development of the capitalist mode of production, or in other words, with the increase in the organic composition of capital, an expression denoting the relation between, quote, living and, quote, objective labor in production, and thus the conditions of its capitalist valorization, the comprehensive planning of developments in material and in value terms, the continuing flux of the forms of capital, the calculability of this rate of surplus value become ever more necessary. In the face of these conditions, the cost of integration weighs more lightly, that of repression weighs more heavily than in the phase marked by smaller units of capital. The institutionalization of class conflict thus means in economic terms a certain calculability of the rate of surplus value and the capability to plan production in the face of the actions of the wage laborers. The pre-planned, pre-announced conducting of wage struggles in accordance with the set timetables and deadlines, the obligation to keep the industrial peace, etc. Politically, it means a certain capacity to plan and foresee even mass articulation. Here the problem of mass loyalty enters into the picture. It is evident that mass articulation, political mass movements that is, can be foreseen and pre-planned only to the extent that they do not pursue an autonomous course. Hence the need to integrate not so much the working class as such, but rather the working class's organized expression, the workers' parties, and the trade unions. Concepts such as, quote, institutionalization, and, quote, legal formalization, and, quote, etc., refer to a change in the relationship between state and social relations. The haphazard regulation of class relations through the economic process is partially replaced by regulations guaranteed by the state. In contrast to the character of law as a form of mediation analyzed above, through which the state relates to, quote, private property owners, end quote, now law involves the state in the social relations of production, albeit within the limits peculiar to law. For our investigation of the relationship between the bourgeois state's system limit and its limit of activity, this type of involvement of the state in the process of reproduction, a familiar, quote, stamocap, or state monopoly capitalist formulation, with a different theoretical intention, means that its limit of activity vis-a-vis the working class is more narrowly drawn. The rights institutions and organizations won by the working class hinder, for example, the pressure on wages, and further the acts of intervention in the rights of the working class, for instance in the regulating of the different funds which ensure the reproduction of the commodity labor power, will meet with considerably stronger resistance, simply because the organized working class is present in the state sphere. This presence refers as much to the existence of workers' parties in the political system as to the existence of specific functions in the state apparatus, which cause the latter to be divided even with regard to the active intervention, social bureaucracy, etc. Third phase. Time for a coffee sip. I'm really trying to finish this book tonight, so I'm cramming. I'm pulling an all-nighter Not really, actually, but, you know, as if I was a student who had a term paper due tomorrow, but instead of a term paper, I have state and capital to finish. Five pages to go, baby. Third phase, the state proclaims a, quote, quasi-right, end quote, to employment. We intend to comment only briefly on this state proclamation of a quasi-right to employment. Although the extraordinary circumstances of West German post-war development have created a kind of customary right in this respect, which makes it appear at least politically risky to, quote, allow, end quote, purgative crises, end quote, as a means of bringing pressure to obtain a desired rate of surplus value, that such a right for workers leads to a change of function in the unions, which now themselves become means of bringing pressure against the autonomous demands of the wage laborers. That the unions move closer to the state structure both institutionally and in their own self-awareness. This has been plentifully discussed since the, quote, concerted action, end quote. Unresolved, however, is the question of how far new limits of state activity have arisen out of this shift of structures between political classes and economic relations. To sum up regarding our, quote, phases and integration model, end quote, if one attempts to attribute the legal formalization of the basic social conflict to the development of a new, quote, function, end quote, of the state, this function could be described as the establishing of a social truce in order to bring about a more constant and plannable process of reproduction. The conditions which determine the possibility of this lie outside its, quote, power, end quote. But this consideration must be strictly distinguished from the attempt and its underlying theoretical consciousness. If one seeks to characterize the basic problem or basic contradiction of this state function, then it consists in the fact that with this social truce, the state has to uphold the contradictions between capital and labor, which endanger it. It may not do away with them. It would be, theoretically and practically, a fatal mistake to consider the level of integration to be a law determining the development of the relation of politics and economics. Any reader with the slightest knowledge of German history will notice that we have left out a particular phase, the different countenance of the bourgeois state in fascism. The repression employed in this phase shows that a level of rights, once attained, can only be reserved with difficulty. And in fact, the relations between capital and labor were not restored in their conceptually pure form. Rather, fascism in its conception of the corporate state referred formally to the degree of integration already attained. We have stated that, in our opinion, the institutionalization of the social conflict between wage labor and capital is a necessary process. That the development of production as labor process and process of valorization makes autonomous, unplannable movements of wage laborers ever more disruptive, so that the costs of integration finally become necessary social costs for capital. This perception is, of course, only arrived at through the struggles of the working class, which precisely are to be limited. One second. This perception is, of course, only arrived at through the struggles of the working class, which precisely are to be limited and made calculable. A question to follow up is whether in the course of time the institutionalization of class conflicts within the bourgeois system causes a level of organized politics to arise which would make the cost of an open repression of labor power and of a dissent from this level appear too high, or whether as a result fascism in certain countries is becoming historically ever more unlikely. We would like merely to gather together a few arguments that would counter this conclusion, and which, at the same time corresponding to the experience of real fascism, speak against the notion that fascism is a creation of the bourgeois state in its function as, quote, ideal total capitalist, end quote, in the sense of the determination of its essence, the state as guardian of the long-term competition transcending interests of the bourgeois class. It has been shown that when, in a crisis, attempts are made to prop up the system of capital reproduction on a short-term basis, this may lead to acts of state intervention in the rights of the working class, which in themselves, i.e. ex post, may appear as, quote, irrational, end quote, in the context of the whole system. The calculability of such risks may have become greater, parallel to the integration of the working class, the trade unions as an early warning system. In the crucial borderline case, however, where the necessary rate of surplus value is threatened, capital will even today still have to throw every consideration of the working class overboard. Reasons for this, quote, short-sightedness, end quote, may lie in the fact that in the interest of the reproduction of individual capitals and of the whole capitalist system, acts of intervention in working class rights are possible, which only later, in the course of the accumulation process, prove to be dysfunctional for capital in the sense indicated above. For one, functional equivalents to a free labor market can emerge in fascism, e.g. black market, private recruitment, etc., as well as the partial reactivation of the DAF, German Labor Front, to, quote, represent, end quote, the interests of the workers. 2. The cost of such acts of intervention can be shifted, for example, through pursuing a policy of military conquest. 3. The act of intervention and its dysfunctional consequence are widely separated. The struggle for the normal working day, for instance, showed that individual capitals can reproduce themselves and accumulate very satisfactorily. The, quote, control, end quote, here takes place within a much shorter space of time. Whilst in the long-term perspective, the working class is destroyed, the limit which is critical for this function becomes visible only later, from the point of view of the whole. 4. The limits to such acts of intervention depend on the condition of labor power, also in quantitative terms. As long as a large reserve army and a growing poorly qualified population exist, there is hardly a necessary, quote, limit, end quote. In such cases, the workers might as well starve, e.g., the Third World. Concluding remarks. To conclude, our thoughts on the historical constitution of the functions of the bourgeois state, we should like to return to the methodological question of how the levels of historical development and general conceptual determination of the state interrelate. In almost every analysis of the, quote, role of the state, end quote, two obligatory contentions are to be found. First, that after the general conceptual determinations, one must investigate the specific historical, national, etc. particularities in order to explain the real historical phenomena. And second, one must, of course, alongside the economic considerations, always take note of the functions of the state relating to class struggle. Even where the interrelationship is referred to, as by Altvater, quote, the character of the state as a bourgeois class state permeates all its functions. They all finally serve to preserve and strengthen the capital relation as a relation of domination and exploitation of the working class, end quote. Even here, the significance of this interrelationship is not worked out. We, for our part, have tried to clarify this meaning and the consequences of a particular historical constellation of class relations for the role of the state, i.e. the state's, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, quote, possibilities and limits, end quote, etc. This inquiry has only an exemplary character, with regard also to other problems and developments of concrete historical capitalist societies. The determination of the specific class constellation is an essential analytical step. But to reach the level of the historically concrete, it is not enough. Thus the concept of the, quote, limit of activity, end quote, of the state, which we derive from the specific class constellation, lies on the historically concrete level. This limit is not quite, however, that which appears empirically in an individual case. For this, problems such as the internal decision-making structure of the state, the scientific and informational foundations of political decisions, the legislative machinery, the specific interests of parties and associations, etc., could be decisive. If we do not go any further into this level, encountered in traditional inquiries of political science, it is not because we consider it irrelevant with regard to the, quote, role of the state in capitalism, end quote. We were here particularly concerned to develop systematically the division of politics and economics, and thus the limits inherent in an inquiry, focusing on the internal structure of organization and of conflict in the state. For just as the forms of appearance of the political process cannot be relegated as, quote, mere superstructural forms, end quote, to the realm of historical particularity, in the sense of given data, which cannot be explained in terms of political economy, and presented as irrelevant for the general laws of motion of capitalist society. So those forms of appearance cannot be understood without analysis of the historical material substance of the political process and without the specific form determinations of social reproduction.